Okay, hi everybody. How's everybody this morning? I hope you're all fine. So I just want to tell you, I've cut out a couple of the slides that were included in that PowerPoint. I need to speed up a little bit, but I've taken out some of the slides that refer to the evolution of the mammals, simply because we are going to discuss that. We have referred to it already, but we're going to discuss that in more detail when we talk about evolution of the mammals. So I'm moving straight on. If you've got the PowerPoints in front of you, move straight on to this slide here, because what I want to emphasize today is two aspects in the history of life on Earth. And that is, first of all, the importance of changes in the structure of the continents. And second of all, the impact of mass extinctions. Excuse my little hat, by the way, but it's freezing cold down in my basement. And this is one of the advantages of recording these classes. You can't see that I'm all wrapped up in a blanket, which I couldn't do in a classroom, of course. So I hope if any of you have any questions before we start, I hope you feel free to just interrupt and ask them. Otherwise, please put your screens on mute so that we don't pick up noise from your house, wherever you are. Okay, so what we're going to, as we go through this entire semester, in actual fact, we're going to continually be referring to the fact that macroevolution has taken place, and that in macroevolutionary processes, what we see are the rise and fall of whole groups of organisms, which very often are extremely dominant. And the one that springs to mind, of course, in everybody's imagination, are the dinosaurs. That's typical. That's a typical evolution of a group with an adaptive radiation of the group into many, many ecological niches. And then often very suddenly, and often to our eyes, because it is so far back in time and in geological history, often mysteriously, the entire group is lost, except often for one or two surviving lines of the group, which themselves then go on to survive and radiate out again. So this is what we observe throughout the history of life: a rise and fall and rise and fall of different really important groups. Not only in animals, by the way, we always tend to emphasize the animals, but that has happened in the plants as well. It's just that we have a much better fossil record of animals, which allow us to tell the story a little bit clearer. So that rise and fall of the different groups, obviously it depends on the rate of speciation, but then also on the extinction rates of its member species. Species do not only go extinct because of mass extinctions. A mass extinction refers to the sudden loss of many different lines of speciation in a group. But this extinction is in fact the norm for most species. The far more species have gone extinct than currently exist, in other words. But today I want to emphasize these two processes especially, and that is the influence of plate tectonics and then the impact of mass extinctions and what we know about the mass extinctions that have already occurred. In terms of the animals, what we observe now in recent times is that the mammals are a dominant group amongst the vertebrates. So, and in telling the story of the mammals, we see those processes all taking place. First of all, mammals have survived two great mass extinctions in the Permian and in the Cretaceous. And they emerged as a little obscure line of species from the Cretaceous mass extinction, and they emerged and radiated. There was a massive adaptive radiation of the mammals following the Cretaceous extinction into all of the available ecological niches which had been cleared by the extinction of so many of the reptile species. So those are the kinds of stories that we tell today. So as far as plate tectonics are concerned, plate tectonics leave a trace in the geological record. And if you're a very clever geologist, you can begin to piece together stories of plate tectonics by looking at geological structures. And we strongly suspect that there have been at least 3 times in Earth's history when continents have got together and have then split apart. We know that this took place 1 billion years ago, 600 million years ago, and 250 million years. The 250 million year episode is still ongoing. That is still underway. But look at those dates and you'll realize 1 billion and 600 million years ago. Well, those were times well before the evolution of multicellular life. And so the impact of those movements, continental movements, would have been on a prokaryote flora, not on multicellular flora. It is this more recent, starting 250 million years ago, approximately, breakup of the continents, which has had the greatest impact on the evolution of the groups that we currently see on the planet. So the theory of plate tectonics is that the crust of the Earth is made up really of 2 kinds of rock: a dense, thin layer of basalt, which is on which sits a lighter continental crust. You can picture the continents actually kind of floating on this basalt crust. And that basalt crust, here, have a look here, and you'll see what I mean. Here's the basalt crust here, and here. Look over here on the left, and this is continental crust. And the continental crust kind of floats on that basalt crust. This basalt crust is continually being manufactured. It's being manufactured by liquid rock, magma, erupting from deep in the earth and coming to the surface, especially at mid-ocean areas called the mid-ocean rifts. The most prominent, the most significant of these is the mid-Atlantic rift. And this magma continually erupts. It tends to erupt rather gently, not in violent volcanic eruptions, but it tends to erupt rather more gently, rises to the surface, and it spreads. And it causes these crusts to actually start moving. And when they do so, they carry with them the continents that float on them. This is the driving force for the movement of the continents. But if you're manufacturing crust somewhere, the Earth can't start expanding. It's of a relatively constant size. So if we're manufacturing crust somewhere, some or other, that crust has to be disposed of, if you want to think of it that way. And that happens at areas where the crust begins to dive underneath. Here's continental crust here. It begins to dive underneath, close by the continents. This is called a subduction zone. And I'll show you just one example of a spreading zone, and then one good example of a subduction zone on a diagram in a minute. As this crust goes deep into the earth, it carries with it lots of sediment, lots of water, especially from the oceanic sediments. That gets heated, that gets superheated as it goes into the Earth's crust, and it produces very, very violent volcanic activity, often associated with the edges of the continent here. So this is a subduction zone. We're losing crust. This is a mid-Atlantic rift zone. This is a rift zone where we are manufacturing crust. And as this crust moves, so it carries the continents with it. Now, if you think about that, let's have a look here. Think about our current disposition of continents. And you'll realize that this means that our continents are sitting on plates, on individual plates. And often on one side of the plate, we're manufacturing crust. On the other side, we're losing crust through subduction. It's not always the case, by the way. These plates can be their movement can be extremely complex. We are simplifying. Let's have a look at the African plate. Here's Africa here. Here's the Atlantic Ocean here. And running right through the Atlantic Ocean in the middle here is the mid-Atlantic ridge. And it is manufacturing crust. The crust is moving in these directions here and is carrying the continents, the South American continent and the African continent with it as it moves. By the way, this grows quite quickly. It grows at about the rate that your fingernails grow, several centimeters a year. And so this movement is actually perceptible. This is real. This is not just theory. This is actually real. It can be measured. So here is a spreading zone. Here is another spreading zone here in the Pacific. And here is a very, very important subduction zone here at the edge of South America. This is an area where this plate is diving underneath the South American continent, and it's being effectively consumed by the heat of the earth underneath. It's melting it, superheating all the water that is contained in it. And it causes this area here to be extremely volcanically active. There are many, many very, very strong earthquakes take place here. There are many, many volcanoes here where the steam and liquid rock erupt to the surface. But this is not a spreading zone. This gets laid down as new continental crust. So this is a very dynamic system. Over time, we see the continents moving, but picture what happens if we've got crust being made in one area and subducted in another area. What happens to the continents that are on them? Well, there's two processes that can take place on continents. They can split apart, and they can collide with one another. Now, remember that this happens over an enormous period of time. It's taken 250 million years, as we'll see in a minute. It's taken 250 million years for us to end up with this situation here. The organisms that are present in these continents, are evolving. As the continents move, for example, they move through different climatic zones. They begin to undergo all sorts of climatic change, which over a long period of time drives evolution. In addition, picture this, once upon a time, this continent here, Africa, was joined to South America. Well, if that was the case, what about this huge ocean currents which now run between? Where were they? Obviously, they didn't exist. If this is joined to that, there's no ocean for an ocean current. But once the continent splits apart, an ocean current can flow through there. And as you probably know, it is the ocean currents which drive climate. So the development of new ocean waterways, new ocean currents, radically changes climate as well. Another thing which is going to start driving the evolution of organisms on these different plates. Picture something else. Have a look here. This is the Indian plate here. Do you know that the Indian continent used to be down here? It used to be part of Africa. And it split apart from Africa and very rapidly moved up here until it collided with Asia. Now realize the Indian plate was carrying with it its own fauna and flora. As it moved over millions of years. They evolved on that. India was essentially an island with its own fauna and flora evolving on it as it moved through these different climatic zones until it smashed into the Eurasian plate here, into the Eurasian continent. That movement of India, of the Indian plate, is still continuing. That is why the Himalayas arose here. The Himalayas are mountains which have been pushed up from this violent collision. It's also why this is a very, very active tectonic area why there are so many earthquakes there, because this crushing is continuing and the earthquakes relieve the tension.
Professor.
Yes, go ahead.
So with the Indian
hold on, I can hardly hear you. Go ahead.
So with the Indian plate and the African plate, like when you say they collide, do you literally mean like they collide into one another and then like they break off from one another, or
they
like
absolutely do collide? Yes, they absolutely do collide. If you look at the geology of India, it is much more similar to Africa than it is to Eurasia.
Okay.
The continent sits on top of that basalt plate, and the basalt plate kind of moves underneath it so that the continents collide and stay on the surface like that. That collision is what pushes up those mountains, pushes up the Himalayas. There's another, Africa is very interesting because there is another rift zone which runs right through Africa. And it's down here, you can see these red dots. Those all mark volcanic and earthquake activity. There's a rift zone which runs all the way through the Red Sea, all the way down through the African continent towards the east, all the way down to here. And we believe that eventually, in millions of years' time, Africa will split here. And there will be another small continent split off from it and begin to move this direction. So the take-home message is that the surface of the Earth is extremely dynamic. The continents are actually moving, but you need to remember that this movement of the continents induces huge changes. The continents carry with them their own fauna and flora, but the very movement of the continents causes huge changes. Huge changes occur on those continents as they move, and that drives the evolution of their fauna and flora. So this is the most brief summary of the most recent movements, tectonic movements. About 252 million years ago, all of the current continents were united into a single giant continent, which stretched all the way from both poles, through both poles, so North Pole, South Pole, with all of you can imagine all the different climatic areas. Here's the equator here. This giant continent was called Pangaea, which just means all of the land in Greek, Pangaea. About 135 million years ago, it split. Obviously, the split began right back here, but by 135 million years ago, the split was quite clear, and it split into two giant continents. This is Laurasia, and that is the North American continent, and Asia and Europe there. The southernmost continent consisted of South America, Africa, Antarctica, and Australia. And they formed a giant continent called Gondwana land, or Gondwana. There it is here. This, by the way, immediately before this happened, there were enormous populations of a very important group called the mammal-like reptiles, which were present on both continents. Once they split apart, those populations began to evolve separately from one another. By 66 million years ago, we could recognize what was happening. You can recognize our present continents. They have split apart, but you can see how very close they are. Here's what I meant about India. India is the separate continent here, small continent, but a continent nonetheless. And it's busy moving up. It's going to crash into Eurasia here eventually. Here's Australia, Antarctica, and by our present time, this is our current disposition. But the Earth still has a future ahead of it, a future where these continents are going to, some of them are going to split apart they're going to break like Africa, others crash into one another and form a new coalitions. So you can imagine the tremendous impact that this has on the living organisms of the Earth. It also has tremendous impact, by the way, on the fauna and flora of the oceans. As these new oceanic currents and everything develop, new oceanic climates develop, which drive the evolution of oceanic populations as well. So that's just your very brief overview of Go ahead.
Would you be able to go back for one more second? I was finishing copying the last part of it.
Which one?
The present. I'm looking at the present now.
This one?
Yeah, you're good.
So all you need to remember about the present is that this movement continues. This is by no means a static situation.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So the other thing I want to finish off our discussion about the history of life on Earth just by talking briefly about mass extinctions. Mass extinctions have occurred with regularity throughout the history of life on Earth. And I would remind you that the first mass extinction that took place was actually one of prokaryote flora, of the bacterial flora on the planet when photosynthesis evolved. And the presence of oxygen in the atmosphere and in the water wiped out by far the majority of the prokaryotes that had already evolved. They couldn't withstand the presence of oxygen, but some of them were able to elaborate on mechanisms that they already had, which developed cellular respiration, which allowed them to resist the presence of oxygen. So that's a typical example. Most get wiped out, but a few have already got mechanisms which they can elaborate on. If those lines survive, they can then radiate out into all of the available ecological niches. So these extinctions are very often, usually caused by changes in the environment of the organisms. And there are various mechanisms which can produce a mass extinction. We register these mass extinctions usually when we look at the fossil record and we see a very sudden, abrupt change in the fossil record, the sudden loss of whole groups, which disappear very suddenly over a very short time. And where there are actually there are numerous mass extinctions, but there are 5 major mass extinctions which are documented in the fossil record. And they very often mark the boundaries between the different eras and things that we talked about before. These mass extinctions have their impact not only on terrestrial organisms, but very powerfully on marine organisms. You need to understand that one of the advantages of being a marine organism is that the marine environment is actually relatively benign. It is relatively constant. It has a relatively constant temperature, depending on what you're adapted to, the area that you're adapted to. It has relatively constant pH. It has relatively constant water chemistry. But these events, which are producing mass extinctions, often radically, suddenly change the chemistry of the ocean. And marine organisms are not able to evolve quickly enough, and huge groups go extinct. And I'll show you 2 particular instances where that was the case. So here, we often don't know, by the way, why it is that these extinctions have taken place. And this is an example here. We know that there was a mass extinction here between 2 eras called the Ordovician and the Silurian. We don't know why, but a huge number, particularly of marine groups, went extinct. Here is another one here, and you can see these mass extinctions by the total extinction rate suddenly jumping. Here, that's on this axis here. You can see here, total extinction rates suddenly jump, and they jump over a very short period of time. This is another one we don't really know. We think that these early extinctions may have been because of sudden changes in plate tectonics, sudden bursts of volcanic activity, which changed the atmosphere radically, induced climate change, but also changed chemistry of the atmosphere and of ocean waters. This one here is was the greatest extinction of all. This is called the Permian extinction. And it's important for us as mammals, because at this time here, there were groups of reptiles had evolved. I won't go into too much detail about it, but there was one group of reptiles which led to to the modern reptiles. We can think about it that way. But there was another group of reptiles called the mammal-like reptiles. They had some very mammalian features. They had their teeth were somewhat differentiated from one another, which is not true of the reptiles. We believe that they may have been predominantly warm-blooded. There are some other mammal-like characteristics to them. They were very distinctly reptilian. They were a very big, very important group indeed. They evolved over a very long time, and within that group of the mammal-like reptiles, a primitive group of true mammals evolved. But they remained extremely obscure. They were just a little side branch of the mammal-like reptiles, which developed into true mammals. All of a sudden, in the Permian, here at the end of the Permian, there was a cataclysmic mass extinction. We do not exactly know why. Some people have posited that it may have been an asteroid that struck the Earth. Other people say no, there's also evidence of, or in many different parts of the world, of sudden burst of volcanic activity, which poured, for example, sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, acidified the atmosphere, and also induced climate change, sudden climate change, which most groups on land were not able to survive. Most terrestrial groups went extinct, including all of the mammal-like reptiles. In the marine system, it was catastrophic, and way more than half of the marine groups died out. And included in that was a group which had been absolutely incredibly common and dominant all over marine systems, which were a group of arthropods called the trilobites. They all died out, all of them, boing, within a million years. They were all gone, the whole lot. So huge changes took place. The Earth was really impoverished in terms of its fauna and flora. But after the Permian, groups which before had been relatively obscure now suddenly began to move. And the one group which was really important were the reptiles, which developed all of the groups of the dinosaurs, which now became dominant. The mammals stayed obscure. They were unable to radiate because the dinosaurs were so diverse and so important. The dinosaurs stayed dominant right up till here, about 66 million years ago, when there was a mass extinction, which you have heard about, of course. And this was the mass extinction which led to the dinosaurs becoming extinct, except for one group of dinosaurs which survived, which is, anybody want to tell me what it is? It's the birds. The birds are the surviving line from the whole dinosaur group, which were all wiped out at this mass extinction event. By the way, there's another marine group which was rendered almost entirely extinct, and this was a group of cephalopods, of mollusks, called the ammonites. And the ammonites were completely rendered extinct, and another group called the nautiloids, which were related, just survived. There were one or two that survived. They didn't radiate afterwards. This was also very, very important. This mass extinction event, we think we know more about than we know about the Permian extinction. This is an extinction which we believe was due to a random event, which was the impact of an asteroid with the Earth. So I'll talk about it a little bit more in a while. The Permian extinction is the great mass extinction. 96% of marine species became extinct. On land, just whole huge, really important groups were wiped out. The importance of geological activity can't be overemphasized.
Professor?
Yes, go ahead.
Can you go back to the other slide real quick, please?
Which one?
Yes, this one.
Uh-huh. Tell me when you're done.
Thank you.
All right. This volcanic activity, anything which brings up material from the Earth's crust to the surface can drastically affect the chemistry of the atmosphere and the chemistry of the oceans. So, for example, it is thought that this Permian extinction may have been due to the fact that there were, especially in Siberia and in India, there was a huge amount of volcanic activity, which raised the concentration of carbon dioxide globally and also poured sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, which caused a sudden increase, a sudden global warming. And this was 3 times more catastrophic than the predicted global warming. I mean, 3 times higher than the predicted global warming for this century, which is about 2 degrees centigrade. within a few 100,000 years, it raised the global temperature 6 degrees centigrade, which very few populations could survive, and very few populations could evolve quickly enough to resist. In addition, it changed the chemistry of the oceans, and it changed the pH of the oceans so that the oceans became acid, and all of these things are what resulted in the decimation of oceanic populations. We know far more about, or we think we do know far more about the Cretaceous extinction about 66, 65 million years ago. And this was not as severe as the Permian extinction, but it still wiped out more than 50% of marine species. It wiped out many, many species and families, whole families of terrestrial plants and animals. And the one which was most spectacular, of course, were the dinosaurs. This was a great mystery until relatively recently, when scientists discovered that there was a particular element called iridium in sedimentary layers, which were laid down at the time of this mass extinction, at the start of this mass extinction. The mystery about the iridium layer was that it occurred worldwide. It could be found worldwide, right in the geological layers, right where the Cretaceous ended and our modern era began. A thin layer would be laid down, is famously referred to as the KT boundary, and that layer contains high levels of iridium, but iridium is not a common element on Earth, but it is a common element in asteroids and in meteorites. And so the theory developed that there had been a huge meteorite impact with rich in iridium, which had vaporized. The impact was so great that it had vaporized the meteorite, basically, carved a huge crater in the Earth, and there had been a massive eruption of magma and steam from this impact, spewed into the atmosphere and spread worldwide, carrying with it iridium, which was rained out and ended up in the sedimentary layers to be discovered later. That sudden impact, the sudden pouring of material into the atmosphere, cloaked the Earth and caused a massive decrease in temperature. It was global winter resulted, and that was what wiped out most of the terrestrial fauna and much of the flora, and also caused huge changes in oceanic chemistry, which wiped out many of the oceanic species, including the ammonites. So that was the theory, and it remained theory until such time as a geologist actually discovered a likely crater off the Yucatan Peninsula. And don't ask me, I've never learned how to pronounce it. And if anybody can pronounce it, I'm willing to hear what you have, how you pronounce it. Maybe we have somebody from Mexico who knows how to pronounce that. I would say Chicxulub, I suppose, but I don't think that's correct. But it is a large, there are traces of a large crater off the Yucatan Peninsula, which is believed to be the site of the impact of this giant asteroid. Of course, with such a huge group as the dinosaurs being wiped out, that freed up an enormous number of ecological niches, because the dinosaurs were very, very, very diverse. Left behind was this obscure little group called the mammals. They were small. What we say they are fossorial. They were fossorial. That means they were creeping around on the undergrowth and everything, totally dominated by the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were wiped out, but a line of mammals survived. And that obscure line of mammals was then able to suddenly radiate out in adaptive radiation to fill all of those ecological niches that were now freed by the death of the dinosaurs to become the mammal groups that we see now. But I want to tell you there was one other really important group of organisms which also survived this mass extinction and then radiated. And those were the flowering plants. When the dinosaurs occupied the planet, there were no flowering plants. All the plants were coniferous, basically, coniferous plants. They were all coniferous plant families. There were a few primitive flowering plants, but they were very obscure. Again, it's a situation. Worldwide, the flora is dominated by these groups which are allied to the conifers and things like that. The mass extinction wipes many of them out. This global winter, most of them died out. But a few of the flowering plants, the primitive flowering plants, were able to survive. And when eventually the global winter ended and everything settled down again, all of a sudden, there's all of these ecological niches that are now free into which the flowering plants could radiate. And most of our flowering plant families date from that time, from that radiation.
Professor?
Yes, go ahead.
So in that second picture you were just showing us, it looked like there's like, is that supposed to represent like the crashing of like the asteroid on Earth?
Yes, here's the asteroid screaming in, and it created a huge a crater like hundreds of kilometers wide. It was so enormous. This is an impact which would have literally been felt all over the entire planet. It was so large.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Now, I have to tell you that there are some competing theories about this mass extinction. Because the dinosaurs, in fact, some people in looking at the fossil records say the dinosaurs were already in decline. The diversity of dinosaurs was already much lower than it had been before. And again, at the same time as this is happening, there was a burst of volcanic activity in many different areas of the world, in Africa in particular, and in India as well. Many scientists believe that although an asteroid impact does appear to have occurred, some scientists suggest that the asteroid impact was just the straw that broke the camel's back, that we were on our way to a mass extinction anyway because of global climate change due to volcanic activity. So that's just something to remember. These are always matters of argument. So now we have to think about this, and that is when we look at our modern era, the current extinction rate on the planet is 100 to 1,000 times the normal background. And that is due to human beings. That is due to our impact on the planet. And many people firmly assert that we are in the midst of a sixth mass extinction. And this mass extinction, unfortunately, extends to virtually every group of organisms on the planet except human beings. We are the one group which are booming worldwide. And this is I won't belabor the point because you probably already know it, but we have had enormous number of impacts on the planet because human beings have this unique ability to alter the environment to suit themselves. But unfortunately, in doing so, we inadvertently alter the environment around us and very often have impacts remote from where we are. So, for example, we create a warm environment in our houses by heating our houses. But where does that energy actually come from? For the most part, it comes from fossil fuels. And those fossil fuels are burned to extract the energy, and in doing so, we create masses of waste product, carbon dioxide especially, which is poured into the atmosphere, which is resulting in changes in global climate. The problem with the modern modern changes in climate and everything is that they are happening so rapidly. There is no time for groups to evolve, to adapt to these changes. And so many groups are going extinct. We still are not up to the level of any of the big five mass extinctions, but many scientists believe we are well on our way to doing so. And many geologists, for example, say that our impact on the planet has been so great that for the first time, we are actually going to start to impact the geological record, that future paleontologists and geologists will be able to see the sudden loss of species and a sudden change in fossil records and everything. And this has led some geologists to dub us as being now in our own era, which is called the Anthropocene era, the era of man. This is not an environmental science class, so I don't want to labor the point. But these are real problems which we have to deal with, and really these are responsibilities which we all bear for the kinds of comfortable lives that we choose to live. So on that rather depressing note on the history of life on Earth, let's move on. Are there any more questions about that? Okay, read through that chapter, please, because it's very complex. I've had to just skip over the surface. All right, so we're going to spend some time in this semester talking about actual organisms and a bit about their biology and their evolution. And we're going to start off, we will not discuss the protists very much, except to refer to them every now and again. I mean, to the prokaryotes. We'll refer to them every now and again. But we're going to start off talking about this. It's a very important group, but you'll see me shrug my shoulders about it a little bit. You'll understand why in a minute. This is a group called the Protists. In former times in biology, most people would have referred to the bulk of the Protists as being sort of just those which were single-celled. But they would have been called the protozoa. But nowadays, this group, the Protists, actually is said to include multicellular organisms as well. So the difficulty with talking about the Protists is that it's really just an informal name, and it names a group which are predominantly unicellular eukaryotes. But when we look at the groupings, we realize that we have to include in this group of the Protists a certain number of multicellular organisms as well, which is hugely complicated. And what has come to be realized is that the Protists is actually a very bad name, because it turns out that the Protists mean those organisms which are not animals, which are multicellular eukaryotes, which are not true plants, which are multicellular photosynthetic and with some other characteristics, and are not fungi. Well, this is not a good way of describing a group, You don't describe a group usually in biology by what it's not. You describe it by what it is. So the problem arises because protists are a polyphyletic group. That means they do not share one common, relatively recent ancestor. There are several different lines of evolution which are included in the protists. So really, as we go through this, just remember that this is a poor grouping, and the grouping is actually changing with modern research, especially DNA sequencing, that sort of thing. The relationship between these organisms in the protists is actually changes the whole time. I know that's a confusing way to start off introducing you to the group, but here's what they are. The protists are eukaryotes. Remember what the eukaryotes are. They are organisms which have membrane-bound organelles in their cytoplasm. They are more complex than the prokaryote cells. They are usually much larger. And really, a protist is a eukaryote that is not an animal, is not a plant, and it's not a fungus. Very bad way to describe it, but that's the best that we can do. And what we end up with is a group where the grouping doesn't really show us any relationship between the members. It doesn't show us any good evolutionary relationship between the members. Nonetheless, let's plow ahead. So here are some typical unicellular protists, and you'll see immediately there's a huge diversity. The protists are a very, very, very diverse group, and they include multicellular and unicellular. Here are unicellular. In the unicellular protists, they vary enormously in their size. Have a look here. These are just about, what, 1 to 2 microns. Here's one. It's a ciliate, actually. We'll learn what that means in a while, which is absolutely enormous. This is actually visible to the naked eye. When we look at the diversity, we see that there are some, apart from those unicellular ones, there's some multicellular ones, which are amongst the biggest organisms on Earth. Here is giant kelp. This is a brown alga. It's classified as a protist. It's a photosynthetic multicellular organism. It is not a true plant. It's an alga. Nonetheless, it's a protist. So their diversity extends even further than that. The protists are enormously diverse in terms of their nutrition, the way in which they get their food. Many are photoautotrophs. That is, they have chloroplasts and they can photosynthesize. There are also many heterotrophs, which are strictly heterotrophic. They either absorb molecules from through the cell membrane from their environment, or else actively feed. They actually chase down and feed on other organisms. Those are true heterotrophs, but there are ones which are mixotrophs as well. And one of them you've probably heard of, and that is this organism called Euglena, which we'll talk about in a while again. Euglena is a photoautotroph. It has chloroplasts and photosynthesizes, but it is actually able to ingest other organisms, and from the outside, it just forms like a mouth, which envelops other organisms and swallows them into the cytoplasm in a vesicle. So those are called mixotrophs if they're able to do both. Euglena is interesting because if you take photosynthetic Euglena and you keep it in the dark for long enough, eventually its chloroplasts die, but it survives perfectly well as a heterotroph. So that's a huge advantage to being a mixotroph. And I'll just finish off by telling you, that again, when we look at the groupings, they are very, very complicated. And we recognize these 5 groups in the protists. They are, yes, you've got to learn them: the excavata, chrome alveolata, the rhizaria, the archaeplastids, and the uniconta. So here they are. And here are these are ones that we're going to do. We're not going to discuss all of these groups. We're only going to discuss some of them. But I just want to point out to you, these are relatively well recognized groups. So this is a decent group. This is a decent grouping here. This is a relatively decent grouping. This is one here. But they do not form a good grouping altogether. Have a look here. This is really doesn't tell us anything about how this group is related to this group. Doesn't tell us anything about how this group is related to this group. These groups sit on their own. That's what we mean by saying they are polyphyletic. They're polyphyletic because we don't know anything about this common ancestor at all. It's just purely theoretical and may not exist at all. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Are there any questions?
I don't have any questions, but
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to clear something up really quick.
Uh-huh.
So the protist, you said, is a unicellular eukaryote where they could potentially have different ancestors, you said?
Yes. Okay, first of all, they are predominantly unicellular, but not all of them are.
Okay, so not all of them. Okay.
Not all of them. No. Have a look here. I'll just show you here. Look, red algae there. Where brown algae here. These are multicellular. So there are some which are multicellular. Most of them are unicellular. It's not a good distinction. And what I mean, as we discuss the groups, I will tell you why they are grouped together like this. Okay, so these are all grouped together for a particular reason. There's a particular morphological feature, which group they all have, which groups them together. And the same here. This is a group. These are grouped together because of some distinctive feature that they all share, which no other group shares. But this, we don't know. Do these have a common ancestor with that? No, we don't know. We don't know.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. So. All right, everybody, then I'll see you, I'll post this, and it will be posted on Wednesday as well.
Professor?
Okay. Yes. So,
As of now, we're not having quizzes like we used to, right?
yes, we are.
We're having
You've got one on Wednesday. I was just about to remind you.
so
Short quiz.
Instead
Just a short quiz.
Instead of our live class, we're gonna have like a quiz, right?
Yes. So Monday is live class. Wednesday, Friday are recorded, and Wednesday there is a quiz at class time.
Can you is it gonna be just like a few questions?
Yes. It's just a few questions.
My only request is if you don't mind making that so after we finish the quiz, we could see what we got wrong.
Yes, sure. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I'll do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right then, everybody. Then I'll see you again on Wednesday. All right.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.